Okay, I'm going to go ahead and present on Clerc through the lens of an interpreter. So let's talk about who this interpreter was. This was Clerc. He was born in a small town near Lyons, France, in the year of 1785. He was born with the ability to hear. However, when he was 1 year old, he was sitting near the fireplace. He took a tumble, landed in the fire, was scarred very badly, and from then on lost his hearing. When he was 12 years old, it was the first time he went to the French Royal School for the Deaf. While he was in school, he progressed quickly. He graduated with very high grades, so much so that he was invited to be the assistant teacher. He taught at that school for a total of 9 years. When he went to England to perform, he ran into none other than Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet. Gallaudet was invited to the French Deaf School to see how Clerc, this is his name sign, taught deaf children. In 1817, Clerc and Gallaudet went to America to set up the first school for the deaf ever to be on American shores. Just to wrap up, Clerc taught for a total of 50 years in deaf education. He helped to create more American schools for the deaf. He also trained deaf teachers. And that's just a little bit about who this person was. So let's talk about the language and culture that he represented. So Clerc, by the end of his life, knew several languages, some written languages and some sign languages. The sign languages that he knew came from his deaf school, and there were technically 2 languages considered at that deaf school. There was what was called the natural sign language. This was deaf-to-deaf communication. And then there was almost like signing exact French. And here's how this came about. The person who set up the school is known as the founding father of the deaf. It was a priest who set up the school in France, and he was the first person in deaf education to actually watch deaf children and see how they're using language, that natural sign language, which he then acquired and changed and accommodated it to meet French grammar and structure. So again, we see that that was that exact French sign language. He also learned how to write in French, and he learned written English on his journey to America. Later in life, we can't say that he knew ASL and represented American Sign Language, but it was actually the French Sign Language that he brought, which blended with Martha's Vineyard Sign Language, which they called an Indigenous Sign Language, with a mix of home sign languages that would eventually become American Sign Language. So let's talk about how Clerc was an interpreter, right? So Clerc became a very skilled sight translator. He was often forced to look at the French words and then sign it in his education, or do the opposite, watch a French sign language and then write it in French language, written language. And when you start to read about his experience, you see that since the time he entered the school, that is how he was taught. That was the learning method, is that he would go from the written word, and in particular, his professor Massot would go from written French to signed French, teaching them that written vocabulary through French Sign Language. In addition, he was involved in performances to earn school for his money. His professor Massot would either show the written word and have Clerc sign it, or do the opposite. Massot would show the sign and Clerc would write the word. So again, this was his first exposure to sight translation. Clerc became the teacher of the deaf school in France, which meant that he was teaching from education from books, right? So Clerc, again, represented several languages, And he translated often from several languages, either from French or English to French Sign Language or American Sign Language. Again, he did not consider himself as a teacher, being an interpreter, because of that sight translation. But that sight translation is taught for how deaf children acquire language, written language. So let's talk about how he was different than before, what it looks like now to be a sign language interpreter, different from him. So as far as sight translation goes, that's a big part of what I do at my job at Amazon. When deaf associates join Amazon, they have to sign contracts and written papers that can have legal consequences, right? There are legal agreements that they're entering into. And some deaf are not able to read the English and understand it there. They need that sight translation. So this is part of what I do in my job. So also, the way that he looks similar is as a deaf educator, right? Deaf educators, I'm not saying that deaf education has not changed. I'm just saying that we still use this method today, sight translation, and it's just a support to this. My father taught deaf students for 45 years and used that same method. So now let's talk about how it looks different, right? Now the role is separate from the educator to the sign language interpreter. And maybe deaf educators don't consider themselves sign language, consider themselves interpreters because of that sight translation. So now let's talk about what are some of the power implications in Clerc's role. So first, he set up the first deaf school in America. And the methodology he used for teaching, understood he used that for teaching teachers of the deaf, students of the deaf, principals of the deaf. He also inspired setting up other deaf schools, leading the way to deaf culture and developing American Sign Language. And a lot of deaf schools followed that model of starting that deaf school. Therefore, he is the foundation of American Sign Language and deaf culture in America. Not to mention, he educated deaf people who then became deaf leaders who set up deaf organizations. So he had a major influence in the American deaf culture and community. So he affected change in many ways. So before this, many people believed that deaf people were not able to be educated. And when he started those performances as a young boy, he was modeling that deaf people can be educated. They can go to school. They can learn, pick up language, become successful, become teachers even. He also showed that deaf people know what's best for deaf people. Deaf people are worth including in our society, that they have a voice, wants and needs, things that were previously not believed. So again, setting up deaf schools all over the United States, because of that, now we have an interpreting community because there's a need to serve that deaf community. There's a need to provide that language access. And Clerc mentioned that his ability to sight translate was nothing in comparison to the other skills of being a creative and intelligent and engaging deaf person. And really, that sight translation is a skill. It's not an easy skill. It can be acquired as a child, of course, but this method was used to teach Clerc, which he then continued in his methodology. Growing up in his deaf school, he was very oppressed. The deaf were oppressed in his school. They weren't proud of themselves or what they were able to do. They didn't consider that sight translation a skill. They still considered that not that great of a skill, but this skill is what led to his teaching career of 50 years. This became the foundation of deaf education all over the world, and he didn't even value that skill. So what can we learn from Clerc? Deaf people should be invested. Their education should be invested in. Their learning is worth investing in. He showed us that deaf people were capable of doing so much, of learning, teaching, establishing deaf schools, being leaders, being principals, even establishing their own community. It's also interesting because he showed us that language delayed, right? Because when he was 12 when he went into the deaf school, and he was able to pick up multiple languages. And if we look at his family, we see that there is a privilege and wealth in his family, and that wealthy family invested a little bit in Clerc, and that tiny investment gave us a massive value as a result. He was able to pick up these languages. Clerc showed us that all humans are worth investing in, and these are my references. Thank you.